This program demonstrates the procedures for the removal and installation of line replaceable units related to the oil system. These include the oil tank, the lubrication unit, the main oil fuel heat exchanger, the oil supply filter, the backup filter, the oil temperature sensor, and the master chip detector. Oil tank, removal and installation. The oil tank is mounted on the fan case at the 8 o'clock position aft looking forward. Removal. Drain the oil tank. Disconnect the electrical connector from the oil quantity transmitter. Disconnect the tubes and hoses from the tank, the drain tube from the scupper nipple, the vent hose at the top of the tank, the suction hose close to the drain port, and the discharge hose attached to the tank deaerator. Retain all the gaskets. Disconnect the hose coupling nut from the oil tank nipple. Disconnect the bonding strap. Remove the nuts and the special bolts of the lower mounts. Keep the dampers. Remove the cotter pin, the nut, and washer of the upper mount. Support the oil tank and remove the shoulder-headed bolt. Remove the oil tank. If necessary, remove the oil quantity transmitter. Installation. Position the oil tank on the fan case and engage the lubricated shoulder-headed bolt in the upper mount. Install the washer and the nut. Torque the nut and install a new cotter pin. Attach the oil tank at the lower mounts with the lubricated special bolts, the dampers, and the nuts. Tighten and torque the nuts. Secure the bonding strap on the oil tank using the lubricated bolt and washer. Torque the bolt as required. Before installing the hoses, make sure the gaskets are serviceable and clean. Connect the drain tube to the oil scupper nipple. Connect the hose to the oil tank nipple. Tighten and torque the coupling nuts. Position the gasket and attach the suction hose to the oil tank with the lubricated bolts. Do the same with the vent hose. And the discharge hose. Tighten and torque the bolts. If necessary, reinstall the oil quantity transmitter. Connect the electrical harness to the oil quantity transmitter. Fill the oil tank. This completes the removal and installation procedures for the oil tank. Lubrication unit, removal and installation. The lubrication unit is mounted on the AGB front face at the 8 o'clock position aft looking forward. Removal. Disconnect the electrical connectors from the master chip detector, the oil temperature sensor, and the oil supply filter clogging indicator. Remove the clamp holding the electrical harness to the bracket. Remove the spring clip and the bushings holding the oil supply tube. Also, remove the bolt of the spring clip on the AGB-TGB supply tube. Remove the front bracket from the lube unit. Free the square mounting flanges securing the 4 scavenge tubes to the lube unit. Remove and keep the gaskets. Detach the oil return tube from the master chip detector. Retain the gasket. Disconnect the oil supply tube from the oil supply hose. Disconnect the forward sump and the rear sump supply hoses. Disconnect the AGB-TGB supply tube. Loosen the nut of the V-clamp and remove the clamp. Hold the lube unit and pull it back carefully to disengage it from the AGB. On a workbench, remove the oil supply tube. Retain the gasket. If necessary, remove the master chip detector and the oil temperature sensor. Remove and discard the O-rings from the lubrication unit mounting flange and from the lube unit drive shaft. Installation. Install a new lubricated O-ring on the lubrication unit drive shaft and one on the mounting flange. Make sure all of the gaskets are serviceable. Position the gasket and attach the oil supply tube to the lube unit. Hand tighten the bolts. Carefully position the lube unit onto the AGB pad to prevent damage to the O-rings. The correct position of the lube unit is determined by a hole located on the seating flange, which corresponds to a pin on the AGB pad. Position the V-clamp on the mating flanges and install the nut. Tighten and torque the nut. Connect the forward sump and the rear sump supply hoses to their nipples. Tighten and torque the coupling nuts. Connect the AGB-TGB supply tube to its nipple. Tighten and torque the coupling nut. Attach the clamp of the AGB-TGB supply tube. Make sure the scavenge tube's mating surfaces are clean. Secure the scavenge tubes and their gaskets with the square mounting flanges, the bolts, and washers. Tighten and torque the bolts. Position the front bracket on the lube unit and secure it with the bolts and nuts. Attach the oil supply tube spring clip to the bracket. Connect the oil supply hose to the oil supply tube. Tighten and torque the coupling nut. Position the gasket and attach the oil return tube to the master chip detector. Tighten and torque the bolts. Reconnect the engine harnesses to the electrical connectors of the oil filter clogging indicator and the oil temperature sensor. Reconnect the MCD electrical connector to the engine harness. This completes the removal and installation procedures for the lubrication unit. Main oil-fuel heat exchanger, removal and installation. The main oil-fuel heat exchanger is mounted on the fuel pump housing located on the AGB rear face at the 7 o'clock position aft looking forward. Removal. Remove the servo fuel heater. Loosen the drain tube coupling nut. Disconnect the IDG oil cooler fuel return tube from the main oil fuel heat exchanger. Retain the gasket. Remove the 6 bolts and washers securing the heat exchanger to the fuel pump housing. Remove the heat exchanger and retain the gasket. Installation. Make sure the mating surfaces are clean and the gaskets are serviceable. Position the gasket onto the fuel pump. Position the main oil-fuel heat exchanger and engage it onto the fuel pump mounting flange studs. Connect the drain tube to the nipple. Secure it with the 6 bolts and washers. Tighten and torque the bolts. Position the gasket and connect the IDG oil cooler fuel return tube to the heat exchanger with the bolts and washers. Tighten and torque the drain tube coupling nut. This completes the demonstration of the removal and installation procedures for the main oil-fuel heat exchanger. Oil supply filter, removal and installation. The main oil supply filter is integrated with the lube unit, which is mounted on the forward face of the AGB at the 8 o'clock position aft looking forward. Removal. Remove the drain plug and let the oil drain from the filter cavity into a container. Remove and discard the drain plug O-ring. Do a visual inspection of the drain plug backup seal. Do not remove it if it is serviceable. Remove the 4 bolts securing the cover to the lube unit body. Assemble a locally manufactured tool and slide hammer and attach it to the drain plug, which has been reinstalled on the cover. Remove the cover. Remove and discard the O-ring. Do a visual inspection of the backup seal. Do not remove it if it is serviceable. Remove the drain plug, which secures the filter element to the cover. Remove the filter element and discard it. Installation. Install a new lubricated O-ring into the groove of the new filter cartridge. Insert the cartridge into the cavity. Prepare the cover. Make sure the backup seal is installed and in good condition. Install a new lubricated O-ring in the groove of the cover. Engage the cover into the lube unit body. Be sure not to turn it to prevent damage to the seals. Secure it with the bolts. Tighten and torque them. Prepare the drain plug. Make sure the backup seal is installed and in good condition. Install a new lubricated O-ring on the plug. Install the plug. Tighten and torque it. This completes the removal and installation procedures for the oil supply filter. Oil supply backup filter. Removal and installation. The oil supply backup filter is integrated with the lube unit mounted on the forward face of the AGB at the 8 o'clock position aft looking forward. Removal. Remove the 4 bolts securing the cover and integrated filter to the lube unit housing. Remove the cover and integrated filter using a locally manufactured tool and a slide hammer. Remove and discard the O-rings. Installation. Install new lubricated O-rings on the cover and integrated filter. Install the filter into the lube unit cavity. Secure the cover with the 4 bolts. Tighten and torque the bolts. This completes the demonstration of the removal and installation procedures for the oil supply backup filter. Oil temperature sensor removal and installation. The oil temperature sensor is located on the lubrication unit mounted on the front face of the AGB at the 8 o'clock position. Removal. Disconnect the electrical connector from the oil temperature sensor. Loosen the 2 bolts retaining the sensor. Pull the sensor out of the lube unit recess. Remove and discard the O-ring. Installation. Install a new O-ring in the groove of the oil temperature sensor. Engage the temperature sensor into the recess of the lube unit. Secure it with the 2 bolts. Torque the bolts as required. Connect the electrical connector to the sensor. This completes the removal and installation procedures for the oil temperature sensor. Master chip detector, removal and installation. The master chip detector, or MCD, is located on the lubrication unit mounted on the front face of the AGB at the 8 o'clock position aft looking forward. Removal. Disconnect the MCD electrical connector from the engine harness. Remove the 4 bolts and washers which attach the oil return tube to the MCD. Disconnect the tube and retain the gasket. Remove the bolts and washers that secure the master chip detector to the lube unit. Remove the MCD and retain the gasket. Installation. Make sure the gasket is serviceable and position it on the lube unit when installing the MCD. Secure the MCD with the 4 bolts and washers. Tighten and torque the bolts. Make sure the oil return tube gasket is serviceable. Position it between the MCD and the tube and secure the assembly with the bolts and washers. Tighten and torque the bolts. Connect the MCD electrical connector to the engine harness. This completes the demonstration of the removal and installation procedures for the master chip detector.